Lewis Hamilton ended his first Ferrari pre-season test second fastest and quicker than new teammate Charles Leclerc, but how did it really go? Hamilton's big move has been F1's dominant storyline so far in 2025, with a huge amount of attention on his first appearances and on-track work with Ferrari. What ultimately matters though is performance, and the 3-day Bahrain test was the first real chance we've had to start assessing how quick and comfortable Hamilton looks in his new car, and of course how competitive that new car will be. This Ferrari move is meant to revive the end of the 7-time world champion's career after his trophy-laden Mercedes stint came to a disappointing conclusion. That happened partly because its ground effect cars have never been good enough to fight for a title, but also because Hamilton in particular really struggled to gel with them. So what's the early verdict of how Hamilton feels in the Ferrari? Well, there is work for him and Ferrari to do, as Hamilton himself admits, but he says he is really enjoying the car. That's already a departure from before, when Hamilton admitted he hated the current era of cars and that they just didn't suit him. And it seems whenever Hamilton was looking a little bit limited on track during testing, that came primarily in a phase of Ferrari working through a run plan that didn't include setup changes to give Hamilton a better feeling in the car. As we'll explain properly a little later in this video, Hamilton's still on a steep learning curve with all the nuances of driving for Ferrari and understanding its car. His initial feedback though is that this is the most positive feeling I've had in a long time. He says he feels the car is underneath him and responding to his inputs, which again is a far cry from how he described the worst of his final days at Mercedes. The end of Hamilton's Mercedes era wasn't poor just because he was driving weak cars. He was slower in them than teammate George Russell, at least in qualifying. Hamilton's natural way of attacking corner entries on the brakes has not been a good fit for a combination of cars and tyres that have been too easily on a knife edge. There were two schools of thought here. First, that it was a ground effect thing. These cars have a tendency to suffer entry understeer and mid-corner instability, as the ground effect is reduced when the car slows down, so the grip shifts from the rear to the front as the car goes through the corner. Plus, the modern Pirelli tyres don't respond well to any kind of slip, so if the front axle slides because of a bit of initial understeer, then the rear axle slides because of some mid-corner instability. It's a double whammy. Plus, tyre temperatures spike and the grip reduces further. Elements of this are obviously intrinsic to the current rules. Hamilton admits his natural style clashes with what the cars need and that he hasn't been able to adapt as well as others, so that is a limitation on his part. The other theory though is that the Mercedes cars Hamilton drove brought the worst of these tendencies to the surface because they were so unpredictable. Even Russell suffered from the extreme balance swings that could be encountered. It was always possible that a switch to Ferrari would mitigate the worst of what Hamilton found, as genetically the Ferraris have seemed a bit more tolerant of a brake late and turn hard style than the Mercedes. There is a limit to how much we can judge that from testing. Hamilton was getting to grips with a new car, so not yet at the point where he knew where to search for the last couple of attempts. And as always, it's that pursuit of the final bit of performance where a car that feels quite good, or a driver that seems in control, can tip over into trouble. But with those caveats in mind, Hamilton looked very much at ease in the Ferrari, and he wasn't having an awkward transition from braking to turn-in, which at times the two Mercedes drivers were. The track conditions were different between Hamilton's runs and Leclerc's, which impacts Hamilton's own reference for how to finesse his driving further in the Ferrari, much less our ability to accurately compare the two. But their fastest laps from day 2, for example, were very similar, and there's no obvious hint of Hamilton overdoing it on corner entry and then bleeding lap time on the exit. He compared well to Leclerc in this regard, and it's a more specific style point that acts as the main differentiator at the moment. As ever, Leclerc is doing more throttle and brake overlap across the lap. This can be dynamite in qualifying in particular, and has always been used to great effect by Leclerc, especially in Bahrain, where some of the corner layouts really reward the unique way he slows the car down and rotates it while maintaining an unusually high minimum speed. At medium speed corners where the front can get overly stressed, Leclerc somehow manages to get the car rotated while still applying a bit of excess throttle, enabling him to get on full power exiting the corner earlier. At the slow speed turn 10 though, there's a hint of some throttle and brake overlap from Hamilton that gains him time against Leclerc. Excess throttle was also evident in the Mercedes days, so it's possible that Hamilton has a similar, if less exaggerated, trait to Leclerc, which could help if the Ferrari can handle it. Another little hint of promise is Hamilton's comparison to Russell when they were running together on track on day 2, which was very similar to how Leclerc compared against the other Mercedes of Kimi and Antonelli. They were fast and slow in the same places, indicating that any differences were car related rather than down to drivers. There was an obvious downside to Hamilton's Ferrari test: the mileage. Hamilton was among the drivers with most to learn in Bahrain, yet ended it with one of the lowest lap counts of anybody. Only Red Bull pairing Max Verstappen and Liam Lawson and an unwell Lance Stroll managed fewer. This was caused by a couple of factors. On day 2, when Hamilton was in the morning session, the unusual sight of a slightly damp track and very light drizzle meant track conditions were poor for a while, so a lot of teams just stayed in the garage for chunks of time. And on day 3, Hamilton's first race simulation never materialised. The start of his long run was aborted early, and though he did reappear, his session was also brought to a premature close because of an anomaly Ferrari spotted on its telemetry. This obviously limited what Hamilton could work through. He'd been dutifully following the team's programme on the first couple of days, so the final day was meant to be an opportunity for him to start to push the car more, play with the setup, and of course finally do some real long running to understand how the car behaves in a race stint. In this respect, the test wasn't as successful as it could have been, and it means Hamilton goes to Australia slightly underprepared, which is a shame even if it was always likely to be the case. However, Hamilton was clearly very happy with what he called the foundation that's been laid for his season. He's delighted with his first month or so at Ferrari, saying it couldn't have gone any better. He even mentioned his crash in the 2023 Ferrari in a private test at Barcelona as something that had to happen, as it came as part of his familiarisation with how a Ferrari feels to drive and push to the limit. He reckons the integration process has been seamless. Adapting here covers everything from getting used to a completely new factory in Maranello, the settings and terminology for different suspension components, and in-car things like the impact that brake bias changes make or the tone of the engine in his ear. He described it all as relearning this new way of working and where the car likes to be driven, as well as building a rapport with team members, including his race engineer Riccardo Adami, with whom Hamilton has been trading notes all through testing about the best way to communicate. The upshot is Hamilton feels like the broader adaptation is on plan and couldn't be further ahead with the short space of time we've had. But as good as this has started, there is more to come. Ultimately, how well Hamilton's getting on at Ferrari is only as relevant as the car's performance, at least in terms of what he may achieve. The reality is that Ferrari had a slightly compromised test, and Hamilton admitted at the end of it, we've definitely got some work to do to improve. From an encouraging first day where Leclerc in particular seemed to be quite at ease with the new SF25, the subsequent 2 days gave the impression of a gap between Ferrari and the real benchmark from testing, McLaren. Lando Norris's eyebrow-raising McLaren long run on the second evening put him 30 seconds up the road in a like-for-like comparison with Leclerc. And even if that was likely an exaggerated deficit, all things point to Ferrari being behind and potentially facing a threat from an improved Mercedes and an inconsistent Red Bull. The usual caveats of judging things from testing were made even worse this year because unprecedented cold weather, drops of rain and big gusts of wind meant conditions varied all the time. Leclerc said the feeling on the first day was good, but as conditions became a lot more difficult on days 2 and 3, the car was trickier to drive, with the balance not quite there. Hamilton acknowledged that Mega Norris long run looked so good, and while Leclerc took it with a pinch of salt, he also admitted it was important to have done a race simulation at a comparable time to understand where we were lacking compared to them, but also compared to my own feeling. Leclerc said we still have quite a bit of work to be done to be ready for Melbourne, which all in all amounts to a less than perfect summary of the week. A positive is that the car doesn't appear to have any huge vices, and if Ferrari could look this similar to Mercedes and Red Bull while being relatively unsorted, it has clear room to improve and maybe a little more room than some others. Exactly where Ferrari shakes out versus its rivals in Melbourne and of course the rest of the season will be critical in establishing the context in which Hamilton's own performance can be judged.